What if I told you that one of the world's longest surviving revolutionary regimes, a government that defied the United States for over 6 decades, has quietly reached the point where it must ask for help just to keep the lights on? Not in secret, not through back-channel diplomacy, but openly. How does a system that once promised dignity, equality, and resistance end up struggling to provide electricity, food, and medicine? And why is the government that once rejected foreign dependence now calling for assistance? To understand what's happening in Cuba today, we need to rewind, not to yesterday's blackout, but to a revolution that reshaped the island forever. This is the story of how the Cuban system was built, how it survived against the odds, and how the same structure that kept it alive may now be pushing it toward collapse. And the answer is more complicated than most people think. Welcome to its financial history, too. In 1959, a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro marched into Havana after overthrowing dictator Fulgencio Batista. His message was simple: Cuba would never again be controlled by foreign corporations or corrupt elites. The revolution promised land reform, universal education, healthcare for all, and economic independence. And in the early years, the transformation was dramatic. Industries were nationalized, sugar plantations were seized. American companies were expelled. The new government aligned itself with the Soviet Union, gaining oil, trade deals, and financial support. For a while, the model worked, at least on the surface. Literacy rates soared, healthcare indicators improved. The government controlled prices, wages, and employment. Cuba built a centralized system designed to protect citizens from the instability of capitalism. But here's the twist. The very structure that promised stability depended on something fragile: external support. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba lost its primary economic lifeline almost overnight. Oil shipments fell. Trade agreements disappeared. GDP dropped by more than 30% in what became known as the Special Period. The cause was clear. Cuba's economy had been tightly planned around a single geopolitical alliance. When that alliance vanished, the entire structure shook. To survive, the government legalized the US dollar, allowed limited tourism, and cautiously opened small private businesses. But the system never fundamentally changed. The state still controlled the majority of economic activity. Productivity remained low, infrastructure aged, and the cracks slowly widened. In the 2000s, relief arrived again, this time from Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. In exchange for Cuban doctors and security cooperation, Venezuela supplied heavily subsidized oil. Once again, external support masked structural weaknesses. But when Venezuela's own economy collapsed in the mid-2010s, oil shipments to Cuba declined. Energy shortages reappeared. Investment dried up. Then came another shock: leadership transition. After decades in power, Fidel handed control to his brother Raúl Castro, and eventually to a new generation under Miguel Díaz-Canel. Reforms were promised. Some private enterprise was legalized. Internet access expanded. But the fundamentals remained unchanged: a state-dominated economy with limited productivity and minimal foreign investment. Then came 2020. The global pandemic crushed tourism, one of Cuba's main sources of hard currency. Remittances slowed. Supply chains broke down. At the same time, U.S. sanctions tightened under shifting administrations, restricting access to financial markets and fuel supplies. Cosmetic effect: tourism revenue collapsed. Fuel imports fell. Power plants, already decades old, began failing more frequently. Blackouts spread across the island. Food shortages intensified. Inflation surged after currency reforms unified Cuba's dual monetary system in 2021. Prices soared faster than wages. For ordinary Cubans, daily life became a struggle. Long lines for bread, hours without electricity, hospitals lacking basic supplies, and then something unprecedented happened. In 2021 and again in later waves of unrest, rare public protests erupted across multiple cities. For a government that had long maintained tight political control, this was a warning sign. The social contract, stability in exchange for political loyalty, was weakening. Now we arrive at the breaking point. By the mid-2020s, Cuba's energy grid was in visible crisis. Aging thermoelectric plants frequently broke down. Fuel shortages limited power generation. Entire provinces experienced rolling blackouts lasting 8 to 12 hours, sometimes longer. The government publicly acknowledged the severity of the situation and sought emergency fuel and financial support from allies and international organizations. For a regime built on defiance and self-reliance, this moment was symbolic. Because when a centralized system cannot provide consistent electricity, it reveals something deeper. The state has lost operational control over its most basic function.